Tonight, I want to begin not with a king, not with a battle, not with a crown, and not even with a fire in the ordinary sense, but with a cave after the fire is already gone. A very old cave. A cave so old that the people who once stepped into it have vanished beyond memory. The smoke that once climbed slowly into its darkness has thinned into nothing, and the only things left behind are stone, dust, old ash, cool air, silence, and the pale, patient testimony of bone. If you imagine that cave now, it is still. The stillness is not empty. It has weight and temperature and texture. The air is mineral and faintly cold. The walls are rough and uneven, damp in one place, dry in another, touched by water so slowly that even centuries would seem hurried beside it. Somewhere farther inside, where the chamber narrows and the dark gathers into something almost physical, a droplet may fall at long intervals, and that small sound only makes the silence feel older. Near the entrance, perhaps there remains the faint memory of light. Not real light, only the idea that light once lived there, that fire once breathed against the walls, that hands once moved there, that bodies once huddled close against winter, that shadows once bent and stretched on stone, and that sleep once came there in uneasy fragments while the night beyond the cave mouth remained full of cold, distance, and other living teeth. Now none of them are there. No voices, no warmth, no footsteps shifting against grit and limestone, no breath, no hands lifting food or tools toward the light. Only earth, only rock, only the remains of a fire that ended long before any language we know was spoken. And on the ground, perhaps half buried in sediment, perhaps broken and scattered among the remains of animals, perhaps so ordinary at first glance that no one would notice without kneeling close, there are bones, human bones, not named people from written history, not rulers, saints, warriors, mothers, daughters, sons, or remembered elders. Only ancient human remains, anonymous and quiet, reduced to surfaces. Fractures, edges, cut marks, and the stubborn endurance of matter. That is where tonight's journey begins, because the story we are entering does not come to us from rumor. It does not come from an old monastery chronicler. It does not come from a scandal told at court, or from a frightened witness, or from a legal accusation preserved by a hostile scribe. It comes from the earth itself, from caves and pits and shelters, from old sediments and ashes, from long bones split open, from skulls altered by deliberate hands, from fragments scattered in layers of time, so deep that the living worlds that produce them have already disappeared completely. And perhaps that is why the subject feels so unusual. It does not arrive burning. It does not arrive shouting. It does not force itself into the room the way later human violence often does. It reaches us through patience. The cave waits. The dust settles. The centuries move overhead. The bones remain. Then, much later, unimaginably later, someone kneels in that old stillness and begins to notice what the bones have kept all along. A line where a sharp edge passed over the surface, a fracture that happened while the bone was still fresh. A skull opened in a way that no simple collapse would explain. A long bone broken, as if what lay inside mattered enough to justify the blow. A pattern so old that no living mind can recover the full emotional weather around it, and yet clear enough that the body still remembers. Tonight we are going to move through that record slowly. Not as horror, not as spectacle, not as a chain of grotesque facts arranged to make the mind recoil, but as a slow archaeological descent through deep time, through caves, ash, cold air, old firelight, and long silence, where some of the oldest and most difficult truths about human behavior still rest beneath the earth. We will move through East Africa, where one fossil shin bone gives us one of the earliest hints of all. We will move to Gran Dolina in Spain, where the pattern becomes fuller and harder to dismiss. We will enter the cave world of the Neanderthals, where sites in Croatia, France, Spain, and Belgium preserve evidence of flesh removal, marrow extraction, and the treatment of human bodies as food-bearing matter. We will move into the late Ice Age world of Gough's cave in Britain, where consumption appears beside shaping, engraving, and ritual transformation. We will move forward again into the farming world, into the pits of Herxheim and the cave of El Mirador, where villages and boundaries do not always soften human behavior, but sometimes give violence a larger scale and a colder structure. And before the end, we will step back, breathe, and ask what it means that this possibility appears again and again in the prehistoric record. Not everywhere, not all the time, but often enough that it must be accepted as part of the wider human range. You do not need to remember every site tonight. You do not need to hold every species name tightly in the mind. You do not need to sort every scholarly debate in the bright, wakeful way one might under a lamp in the middle of the day. It is enough to follow the atmosphere. Stone, ash, bone, old darkness, cold air at the entrance of a cave, a small drop of water in the farther chamber, a hearth long dead, a mark on a human bone that survived when almost everything else did not. That is enough. And one more thing is enough too. Distance. The caves are empty now. The fires are out. The hands that cut are gone. The hunger is gone. The fear is gone. The old winter pressure is gone. The grief, the confusion, the rituals, the panic, the meanings that once seemed obvious to the living. All of it is gone. The people who suffered are beyond suffering now. The people who acted are beyond appetite now. Nothing remains urgent there except evidence. That matters. It matters because deep time protects us from the heat of what happened. It does not erase the truth. It does not smooth away the marks, but it cools the event into trace. It turns action into residue, fear into pattern, and living urgency into something held at the far end of a very long silence. So let the cave remain around you for a little longer. Let the air stay cool. Let the darkness feel old rather than threatening. And before we go farther into the prehistoric night, let us begin where archaeology must begin, not with outrage, but with a slow question of what bones can actually tell. When modern people hear the word cannibalism, the mind reacts before it thinks. The word arrives carrying taboo almost by itself. It belongs to that small class of human acts that seem to cross not only moral boundaries but imaginative ones. To consume another human being feels, to most of us now, like stepping outside the circle of what should be possible among the living. And yet, archaeology cannot begin there. Archaeology does not have the luxury of beginning with recoil. It must begin with evidence. That is one of the most important things to remember tonight. Archaeologists do not identify prehistoric cannibalism by reading ancient minds, and they do not identify it by projecting modern fear backward into the dark. They identify it by studying how bodies were treated, and by comparing that treatment with what is known about butchery, burial, ritual handling, carnivore damage, weathering, burning, fracture, and the many other processes that alter bone after death. In anthropology, scholars sometimes use broad distinctions. Endocannibalism refers, in general terms, to the consumption of members of one's own group, often imagined in historically known societies as funerary, memorial, or spiritually meaningful. Exocannibalism refers to the consumption of outsiders, enemies, captives, or rivals, often associated with war, terror, conquest, or symbolic domination. These categories can be useful, but prehistoric archaeology cannot always fill them with certainty. A cut mark on a rib does not tell us whether the living grieved the dead or hated them. A broken skull does not reveal whether it was opened in reverence, in fear, in hunger, or in triumph. Bones preserve treatment more reliably than they preserve motive. So archaeology asks a quieter question. Were these human remains processed in ways similar to the ways prey animals were processed for consumption? That is the center of the matter. Not every cut mark means cannibalism. Human societies have treated their dead in many ways, some of them involving disarticulation, defleshing, breakage, burning, cleaning, transport, or secondary burial without any eating at all. Flesh may be removed as part of a funerary rite. Bones may be rearranged and kept. Skulls may be modified for reasons entirely symbolic. Fire may touch remains after death without implying cooking. Carnivores may gnaw. Water may scatter. Sediment pressure may crack. Trampling may scratch. Time itself is not passive. It works on bone. So archaeologists move slowly. They look for convergence. Cut marks placed where skinning, dismemberment, or flesh removal would make anatomical sense. Fresh bone fractures consistent with marrow extraction. Human tooth marks, burning suggestive of heat during processing. Human remains discarded or scattered in contexts more like food refuse than like formal burial. Parallels between the treatment of human bones and the treatment of butchered animal bones found in the same layer. Repeated patterns across multiple individuals. When enough of these signs come together, the interpretation strengthens. This careful method matters because it lowers the emotional temperature. It reminds us that what we are doing tonight is not walking into sensational darkness, but into a patient kind of truth. Bones do not shout. They do not accuse theatrically. They keep physical memory. That is all. And physical memory can be astonishing. A stone blade leaves a different mark than a tooth. A fresh break differs from a break made centuries later when the bone had already dried. Bone exposed to fire changes color and texture in ways that vary with the intensity and duration of heat. A skull intentionally opened does not always fracture like a skull crushed by later collapse. A line made by trampling has a different character from a line made by slicing flesh from muscle attachments. These distinctions are quiet, technical, and often microscopic. Yet whole interpretations rise out of them. A cut mark left by stone often appears as a narrow V-shaped incision. Its angle matters. Its depth matters. Its location matters most of all. Marks near joints may suggest dismemberment. Marks along major muscle attachments may suggest defleshing. Repeated cuts in parallel directions may suggest deliberate slicing. Certain marks around the jaw or face may point to the removal of cheeks or tongue. Certain patterns on ribs may suggest opening the body. Certain fractures in long bones may tell us that someone wanted access to fat-rich marrow inside. Fresh bone behaves differently from dry bone. That is important enough to say slowly. Fresh bone bends a little before it yields. It fractures and curves, spirals, and smooth-edged breaks. Dry bone is more brittle. It cracks in different ways. If a human long bone was broken while still fresh, and broken in a way similar to the way animal bones were broken when prehistoric people sought marrow, then the case becomes stronger. Skulls tell another story. A skull can collapse under sediment pressure or be crushed by later movement, but deliberate opening often creates patterned breaks. Repeated removal of facial bones, careful trimming of cranial edges, or consistent access to the vault suggest intention. Later in tonight's journey, this will matter a great deal. Burning matters too. Bone altered by heat may darken, whiten, crack, warp, or flake in ways that reveal whether it was near a hearth, inside a fire, or exposed to cooking temperatures. Burning alone proves little. Burning with cut marks, fractures, and food-like discard patterns says more. And then there are tooth marks. These are among the most intimate traces of all. Human tooth impressions on human bone bring the act very close to the body. They are not theory. They are contact. Even so, archaeology remains modest, because the same physical treatment can belong to different emotional worlds. A body may be enemy. It may be kin. It may be sacred. It may be food. It may be all of these in overlapping ways. Archaeology gives us acts first, meaning second, if meaning survives at all. Bones are strange archives. They do not keep everything. They do not keep spoken explanation. They do not keep prayers or quarrels or justifications in clear form. They do not keep the look in one person's eyes when another lifted the tool. But they keep contact, force, sequence, repetition. A cut, a strike, a break, a burn, a pattern, stone, bone, and time keep their own records. That may be the gentlest truth in the whole subject. We are not being asked to relive ancient panic. We are only being asked to sit quietly beside the hardest material facts that deep time was willing to preserve. And once we know how to look, we can begin to move backward into the oldest part of the story, into East Africa, where one fossil shin bone gives one of the earliest hints of all. Deep time has a different emotional weather from ordinary history. It is so far away that the usual warmth of the human world disappears. Around 145 million years ago, in what is now Kenya, a fossilized tibia from a hominin carried cut marks made by stone tools. They were not random. They appeared consistent with slicing flesh from the leg. The bone belonged to an early human relative, perhaps Homo erectus, or another nearby hominin. The being who made the cuts may have belonged to the same species or another one living in that broader African landscape of overlapping lineages. That ambiguity belongs to the age itself. Early humanity was not arranged in neat lines for our convenience. But even so, the implication remains powerful. One human-like being cut flesh from another human-like being. That fact, placed so early in the story, changes the whole emotional horizon. We are far beyond villages here, far beyond burial systems, far beyond ritual vessels, far beyond theology or writing. This is a world of open land, predators, scavengers, simple tools, and bodies understood first through survival. The simplest interpretation is practical. A body had become flesh. A limb had become tissue that could be sliced away. That does not make the act gentle, but it makes it old in a way that strips away much later symbolic complexity. There may have been no elaborate funerary doctrine, no stable taboo, no social explanation that survives. There may only have been need, opportunity, and the hard ecological logic of a world with almost no insulation between life and death. The Kenyan tibia is not a complete case. It is one clue, one line cut into the deepest part of the record. But it matters because it tells us that the possibility was already present very early indeed. The human body, even then, was not always untouchable. And yet, one bone is one bone. If we want a fuller pattern, a site where multiple bodies, multiple marks, and a cave context gather into something much harder to dismiss, we move forward to northern Spain, to Gran Dolina. Gran Dolina lies within the Sierra de Atapuerca, a landscape extraordinarily rich in human prehistory. There, in deposits roughly 800 years old, archaeologists found the remains of Homo antecessor together with stone tools and butchered animal bones. Several individuals were represented, adults and children. The human remains were not arranged as honored dead. They were scattered and mixed within a deposit that looked less like a burial place than a place of processing and discard. The bones themselves sharpen that impression. Cut marks show flesh removal. Long bones were broken while still fresh. Some fractures are consistent with percussion and twisting. The treatment of the human remains closely resembles the treatment of animal remains found in the same deposit. One child's vertebra carries marks suggesting removal of the head. Taken together, the evidence forms one of the clearest early patterns of cannibalism in the human record. And perhaps the most striking thing is not simply that it happened, but that it appears to have happened more than once. This does not look like one singular accident. It looks like repeated behavior. Human bodies were processed with the same practical logic used on prey. Why? Archaeology can only move so far. Nutritional cannibalism under difficult conditions is one possibility. Intergroup violence followed by consumption is another. Rival groups may have encountered one another in a world where bodies could become food. Children may have been especially vulnerable, or there may have been meanings now too remote to recover. The bones do not settle that question, but they do settle something else. The dead were handled in a practical, material, food processing way. Gran Dolina says this more clearly than the Kenyan tibia could. The cave says, here, the pattern is stronger, the cave says. Here treatment repeated, the cave says. Here the body crossed the same threshold as prey. And still, the cave is quiet now. The species is gone. The fear is gone. The hunger is gone. The children are beyond pain. Only the marks remain. That may be the odd mercy of deep time. It does not erase difficult truths, but it lowers their heat. The cave becomes a deposit. The act becomes a sequence of physical traces. The urgency vanishes. We are left only with the cool force of evidence. So let Gran Dolina sink back into stillness for a moment. Let the chamber empty again. Let the tools lie where they were, or where archaeology lifted them. Let the dust gather, and from there move forward with me into the colder cave world of the Neanderthals. For many years, Neanderthals were imagined badly, as blunt creatures standing outside the human story rather than inside it. That old picture no longer holds. They were tool makers, hunters, fire users, social beings, and in some places, perhaps barriers of the dead. They cared for injured companions. They survived in difficult climates. They were neither simple nor senseless. This matters because once we recognize their complexity, evidence of cannibalism among them becomes more difficult in the most honest way. It no longer belongs to caricature. It belongs to a people close enough to us that their caves feel almost like dim reflections of our own possible range. At Krapina in Croatia, excavated more than a century ago, archaeologists found large numbers of fragmented Neanderthal remains. Skulls broken, bones shattered. A puzzle entered prehistory early. Were these bodies butchered and consumed, or had time and geology made the evidence misleading? Over the years, the debate shifted, but it never vanished entirely. Some evidence, including cut marks and fresh bone fractures, strengthened cannibalism interpretation. Yet Krapina also showed how easily interpretation can outrun evidence if one is not careful. It became a lesson in archaeological patience. The site itself taught scholars to doubt, and then to test those doubts against the material. Later, sites would speak more clearly. At Moulin-Gercy in France, Neanderthal remains from several individuals were found together with deer bones processed in similar ways. Human bones bore cut marks, evidence of dismemberment, and long bone breakage for marrow. The parallel treatment of human and deer remains is powerful. It suggests not merely unusual handling of the dead, but handling according to the logic of food processing. At El Cedron in Spain, the remains of around a dozen Neanderthals, including children, showed cut marks, percussion damage, and human tooth marks. Genetic evidence suggests many were related. That detail creates a particular sadness around the site. Whether they were killed by outsiders consumed in a moment of desperate scarcity or caught in some more complicated event, the bones alone do not fully say. But they do preserve the treatment. At Gough in Belgium, the evidence becomes almost severe in its practicality. Cut marks, fresh fractures, marrow extraction, and after consumption, some bones reused as tools for stone working. The body moved from flesh to marrow, to bone to tool. It is difficult to imagine a clearer reduction of the body into resource. Taken together, these sites suggest that cannibalism belonged to the Neanderthal behavioral range across multiple regions. It may have emerged under different pressures in different places. Hunger in one cave, violence in another, perhaps meanings now lost in a third. Archaeology does not need to force one explanation over all of them. The repetition itself matters, and still the caves are empty now. That sentence matters again. The caves are empty now. No one waits by the hearth. No one is still hungry there. No one is still grieving there. No child still fears what happened there. The act has ended by tens of thousands of years. Only the record remains. One must repeat that often enough for a difficult subject like this. The caves are empty now. The fires are out. The bodies are beyond harm. The marks have already been made. Nothing there can reach us except as evidence. And the evidence tells us something else too, something that prevents easy simplification. Neanderthals cannot be reduced to one behavior. The same people who may have buried their dead in some contexts, or cared for injured companions in others, also left behind caves of butchery. That is not contradiction, it is range. So let the Neanderthal caves dim a little now. Let the cold air remain. Let the bones fall quiet. And from there move with me into a later human world. The late Ice Age world of Homo sapiens, where cannibalism appears again. But besides something more ceremonial, more careful, and perhaps more difficult to think about calmly, the world of Gough's Cave. Gough's Cave in Somerset dates to around 14,700 years ago. These were modern humans living near the end of the last ice age, in a world still cold. Still hard, but also fully human in symbolic complexity. These were people capable of art, pattern, memory, and material symbolism. That matters, because the evidence here goes beyond consumption alone. Human remains at Gough's Cave show cut marks. Flesh was removed from faces and bodies. Long bones were broken from marrow. Human tooth marks are present. These signs already place the cave firmly within the cannibalism record. But then there are the skull cups. 3 human crania were modified carefully into bowl-like vessels. The shaping was deliberate. The faces were removed. The edges were worked. The result suggests more than crude access to brain tissue. If the only aim were quick extraction, there would have been easier methods. Instead, the skulls were transformed. Then there is the engraved forearm bone. A zigzag pattern was cut into a human radius after defleshing and before further breakage. That sequence matters because it means the engraving belonged to the process, not later decoration. not some random mark on an already dry relic. It happened while the body was still being transformed. This is where Gough's cave becomes one of the most difficult and fascinating sites in the prehistoric record. Because hunger alone begins to feel too small, the evidence suggests that human bodies were consumed and also made meaningful. They were not simply reduced to flesh, they were shaped into objects, marked, altered, made to participate in a pattern that likely had symbolic force. What kind of force? We do not know with certainty. Perhaps funerary cannibalism, perhaps ritual incorporation, perhaps mourning through transformation, perhaps something more complex and less familiar. The distance is too great for exact recovery, but archaeology allows us to say when the simplest explanation is inadequate. Gough's cave is one of those times. The body here appears not only eaten, but transformed. That changes the emotional atmosphere. Cannibalism no longer belongs only to hunger or violence. It belongs to ritual possibility. Humans rarely do even their darkest acts without wrapping them in meaning. Gough's cave feels like exactly that. A place where consumption and symbolism met. And because this is difficult to hold for too long, let us pause again. The fires are out now. The skull cups are still now. The engraved bone no longer needs to say more than it already has. Whatever those meanings once were, they have dimmed into archaeology. That is part of the quiet safety of time. It preserves enough to trouble us, but not enough to drag us back into the emotional world of the act itself. Then the story changes again. The Ice Age loosens. Villages appear. Farming spreads. Pottery. Fields. Domesticated animals. Boundaries. And denser communities reshape the human world. It is easy to imagine this as a softening. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was not. Settled life can create stored food and continuity. But it can also create tension, identity, hierarchy, ritual intensity, and larger forms of organized violence. Herxheim in southwestern Germany belongs to that later farming world. There, archaeologists found pits containing thousands of human bone fragments, representing perhaps more than 1,000 individuals. Men, women, children, infants. The scale alone changes everything. One or two butchered bodies can still be imagined as a singular event. 1,000 bodies suggest something organized, repeated, or ceremonial on a much larger scale. The remains show patterned treatment, cut marks, fresh bone fractures, repeated skull processing, scalping, tongue removal, marrow extraction. Burning in some cases, the bodies were not merely buried, they were worked upon. And then another detail deepens the strangeness. Many of the people were not local. Isotopic evidence suggests they came from different regions. This raises several possibilities. Perhaps Herxheim functioned as a ritual center to which people were brought. Perhaps captives were processed there. Perhaps it was a site of sacrifice. Perhaps violence and ritual overlapped in a way difficult to separate. What seems least likely is simple famine. The repetition is too formal, the scale too large, the methods too structured. Herxheim reminds us that farming did not guarantee gentleness. Villages can intensify identity and exclusion. Boundaries make insiders and outsiders visible. Ritual can become more organized, not less. Violence can scale. And then there is El Mirador in Spain, where the pattern changes in tone, but not in difficulty. There, the remains of around 11 individuals show cut marks. Burning, breakage, and human tooth marks consistent with cannibalistic processing. Isotopic evidence suggests that the dead were local. This feels closer, more intimate, not a distant ritual center drawing people from afar, but something nearer. Perhaps local conflict, perhaps neighboring communities turning on one another, perhaps domination after death. Cannibalism in such a setting may not be about simple hunger. It may be about power. To consume the defeated is to extend violence beyond death, to make victory bodily, to erase the enemy in the most intimate way possible. Later human societies would sometimes do similar things under the logic of humiliation, terror, or conquest. El Mirador suggests that prehistoric Europe could also reach that point. Herxheim shows scale. El Mirador shows local rupture. Together they tell us that the Neolithic world was not protected from the darkest human possibilities by the fact of settlement. Agriculture altered the human condition. It did not purify it. If we widen the frame beyond Europe, the pattern becomes more broadly human. Late prehistoric cases in the Americas, such as cowboy wash, preserve evidence of butchery and ingestion under conditions likely tied to violence or severe social stress. Ethnographic and historical evidence from parts of Oceania and elsewhere shows that human consumption can belong not only to hunger, but to mourning, ritual incorporation, warfare, domination, or cosmology. These later societies do not explain the Paleolithic caves directly, but they remind us that cannibalism is not one thing. It belongs to a range of motives and meanings. That may be the deepest lesson the record offers. Cannibalism was not universal. It was not humanity's rule. It did not define early people, but it recurred often enough, in enough forms, that it belongs within the wider human behavioral range. That sentence is difficult, but if held gently, it is also calm. Human beings were never only one thing. The same species that paints, buries, nurses the wounded, loves, mourns, sings, and makes ritual also contains the potential, under certain pressures or within certain meanings, to cut, crack, chew, shape, and consume the human body. Hunger may do it, ritual may do it, fear may do it, violence may do it, mourning may do it, power may do it. A single explanation is always too small. And now, because the bones have said enough, the world can begin to soften again. Let East Africa recede into heat and distance. Let Gran Dolina grow quiet. Let the Neanderthal caves darken. Let Gough's cave keep its skull cups in stillness. Let Herxheim close over its pits. Let El Mirador settle into cave dust. Let the wider world return to silence. Let the archaeologist step back from the table. Let the microscope lamp go dark. Let the museum drawer slide shut. The bones stayed, the fire went out, and the silence kept the longest memory. Hold that sentence softly now. The bones stayed, the fire went out, and the silence kept the longest memory, because that is the gentlest way to leave this story. Not in panic, not in moral noise, not in the modern urge to force one final meaning onto people who can no longer answer, but in the recognition that prehistory is a field of long silences. And in those silences, the body sometimes preserves what everything else has already forgotten. A cut, a break, a burn, a shape, a pattern. That is enough to know these things happened. Enough to know they did not happen everywhere. Enough to know they happened differently. Enough to know that humanity has always been more complex than comfort prefers. And now the cave can close again. The last ember is gone. The air grows colder. The stone grows darker. The old hunger is over. The old fear is over. The old ritual is over. The old violence is over. Only deep time remains. And deep time is patient. Patient enough to cool even the hardest parts of the human story into something that can be observed without being feared. So let the cave mouth darken. Let the drop of water continue somewhere far inside. Let the bones rest where time has carried them. Let the old hearth stay gray. Let the last trace of smoke vanish into the roof of the world. And let all of prehistory, with its strangeness and its tenderness and its cruelties and its silence, drift gently away from the mind until there is nothing left but stillness, dark stone, cool air, and the soft, safe feeling that everything old has finally become far enough away to rest.